part one and a part two. So we're really thrilled to have Boaz Tarsi, who has put a lot of effort into giving us some really important information. And together with Amalia Kedem, we're really looking forward to hearing from them. Boaz is Associate Professor at the Jewish Theological Seminary. He's a sought-after teacher, speaker, singer, composer. So we're delighted to have him. And Amalia is a member of the music department of the Sound Archive of the Israeli National Library in Jerusalem. So I'm now going to hand over to you, Amalia, to start the session.
Thank you, Geraldine. Thank you, Mark and Lori and everyone responsible for these wonderful sessions. So this is actually an ongoing conversation that I was privileged to have with Boaz in the past almost 20 years. Mostly it was in the framework of a group of researchers of Ashkenazi music at the Jewish Music Research Center at the Hebrew University, together with Professor Eli Schleifer and Professor Edwin Sarusi and many researchers, young and old. And this is for me, it's a very fascinating topic to talk about the theory of Ashkenazi prayer, of Ashkenazi tefillah. Symbolically or not, we are all putting some order in things these very days. So it looks appropriate to also in the theory of Jewish music. As this group and listeners to these conversations come from various backgrounds, and I assume it's safe to say that most of you are not dealing with theory as a daily thing, and it's of course okay to be a chazan, and being a chazan, leading a prayer is a practical thing. You don't have to know the exact theory of Ashkenazi prayer in order to be a good chazan. However, once we go into learning and teaching this practice, and we want to think about it theoretically, then we've all been using terms that have to do with theory. And as a matter of fact, there is a lot of confusion with everything that has to do with this theory. What is a steiger? What is a mode? What are we using? What do we apply when we say different prayers? So what we have been using so far was convenient. We had these Adonai Malach mode, Magen Avot mode, Ahava Rabba mode. These are all terms that I'm sure you're familiar with. However, there are a lot of inaccuracies, and once we go into detail and we try to apply those terms to specific prayers and understand how they work, there are a lot of confusion. And so it's not unnecessary to look into it. So this is going to be a theoretical session, a theoretical presentation, and we ask you to bear with us and try to follow what Boaz is trying to present, have been trying to do for the past 2 decades almost. And I think this is a wonderful audience for this topic. So without further ado, let's start. Boaz, please.
Yeah, okay, I just want to say that I'm also counting on Amalia to interfere or intervene when it gets too abstract and too theoretical, and she knows how to translate it. We started with a sort of a cutesy question: do we have a theory? And you know what, we do. But we can say, yeah, but. I can say that we do because I already explored it, but it's also, we can actually take it back to the original search, and there are two options, I think. We can start with a premise that either we do or we don't. I think that starting with we don't is not the way to go, because it's really hard to prove that something does not exist, Plus, if you go with yes, and you find at the process that it doesn't compute, then you can explore the not. And in that sense, there is a recursive quality to this whole search, in the sense that we make an assumption, which may be correct or not. We go with it and develop something, but as we develop, you can always go back and make adjustments or corrections if something doesn't work or doesn't compute. And that will become a part not only of that particular question, but also, what is Magen Avot, for example, or Naim Alach for that matter. So I'm starting with the premise that there is. Now, another reason that sort of supports it is that there are three primary qualities to this practice, which actually many people in the field are not aware of it, even certainly not musicologists, but even people in the field. First of all, that we know that this is a tradition that was mostly transmitted orally, and to a certain degree still does. And the second thing is that we saw your note too, it's extemporized. In other words, there's an element of improvisation in there. What's important, though, is that the improvisation, of course, is not a free-for-all. It's an element within the framework. And the last thing is that, unlike other disciplines, so far as we know, it did not have a theory. It did not evolve, and we know that it was always sung. We know that Ashkenaz, 11th century, it has been a while, and we don't find any theoretical discourse that accompanies the practice. And from that, I can actually conclude one thing, that within the oral tradition, not only music was transmitted, because there is also the extemporized element. So with the tradition, and I'm not saying that I know how, but what was transmitted also was transmitted sort of a bunch of rules, a bunch of instructions on how you do it. Again, because it was not transmitted with the music. In other words, it's not a tradition when you just get a copy of something and sing it. And even if you hear something, there are ways of doing it differently, but you cannot do it like free-for-all. So with the music comes something else, a whole set of rules how to do whatever. I'm not getting into the point of how it was transmitted, but what I can say is that if we try to conceptualize this, and it's something that does happen in the schools in the 20th century, I'll get to that in a second, but if I were to sort of try to translate those instructions, it will basically express itself in terms of music theory. And I can sort of jump to the 21st century, because when we teach cantors these days who did not get it in the oral tradition, basically I can translate conversations even in Judah Cohen's book, when a coach tells a cantorial student, well, here you should move a fourth up, and you should be in Ahava Rabbah, here should be an augmented second, or when a Nusach class in JTS, we tells, here on this text you're in Adonai Malach, but now you should go to the fourth degree and you could do something there. In other words, all of those instructions can be expressed in terms of music theory. Now, what kind of theory is a different story, but I actually claim that to try to unpack the system in terms of music theory is also the best way to understand it, both to explain it, both to unpack it, and also to find its underlying inner workings. The other approaches were historical, or comparative, or ethnomusicological, and all of those, I don't want to get into the details or criticize other work, but it's insufficient. At best, get some kind of a dead end or mistakes or things that you can't figure out. But that one of the reasons is that hold on a second. Okay, let me take it from somewhere else. When the important thing about this theory, though, is yes, from the start we have to admit or allow to the fact that this is going to be a unique kind of theory. We cannot necessarily go dominant tonic triads. So it's going to require, or at least we have to allow the fact that it's going to allow something unique, and the theoretical concept might have to be a unique paradigm, sui generis, etc. And so that will allow us to incorporate all sorts of other factors into it. And now there are two side comments that I'm not going to develop them, but they're important to keep in mind. We are talking about a discipline that's really an integral part of a much larger phenomenon and a framework. In other words, the music is one factor. There's a lot of other factors going on, and not only the music is inseparable from them. We have to somehow incorporate that into the musical discussion, including the theory. And the other thing that we have to sort of remember is that the huge framework of reference of all sorts of input in the music. So far as Jewish practice is concerned, most of it is run with what we call tacit knowledge. In other words, there are a huge amount of stuff that people simply know. And that presents a problem, for example, from the outsider who tries to explore it, and I've read all sorts of work. There are things that they just assume, but everybody knows, but they don't know, and we don't tell them. So the complete outsider has a problem. The complete insider also has a problem, because we have to separate all sorts of insider concepts so we can have a look at it from outside, and there'll be one example of it at the end of the session. So those are just things that we have to take into account when we explore this theory. And so far, I sort of explained why I think it's there. And then there is something really important. We already have some evidence of that theory. I mean, we have theoretical discourse that started from the very sort of last quarter of the 19th century. We don't have so much, but we have enough texts that do try to tackle a theory. And what we need to do is in order for the theory to be meaningful to the practice, we can't just go and make up whatever we want, even if it's going to be correct, because it has to somehow fit the practice. And so the idea of looking at what this discourse is usually by semi-scholars, insider practitioners. So it's important to look at what they did say. First of all, not necessarily to accept everything that they say, but to see what they say and how, and see what of it is, influences our way of going about it. And here comes another recursive process, although it's done by two different parties. There is the body of theory. Most of those people who wrote it are dead. Let me not insult anybody. Most of them. We're going to look at some live people as well. But the one who is doing the recursive process is not them, it's me. So I'm going to go back to what they said and then see what may fit and where things might have gone wrong, and how it can help us fix them. Also, I'm doing it from a different point of view. First of all, I'm doing it 100 years later. We have a whole bunch of conceptual, methodological, epistemological tools at our disposal that they didn't have. We have been exposed to many other models, and just more repertoire. And so the first thing that I run into that is a good beginning, that's where I actually try to start with that body of information or data. And there is something that's actually not only right, it's sort of impressive, because in a way they could have, I think in the way they were thinking, they were ahead of their times. I'll get into the whole details in a second. But at the same time that they had something that I think we should keep and hang on to and rework later, they also very early took some kind of a divergence. There was a wrong turn or a divergence which created trouble. And as things so happened throughout the historiography or history, more and more things, it just one problem begat another one and another one, and we end up with all sorts of confusion that's just accumulated from that wrong turn. But in terms of one of the important things that we can take from them, although I'm not going to develop it, it's just something to keep in mind, is that their idea, and again, as insiders, we don't even see it, but their idea of the whole framework is that it's a framework of classification, of taxonomy, that there is one system and there are subcategories from which that constitute that discipline, and the way to go about it is to examine those taxons. In other words, it's the taxonomy, and the other thing is the classification. In other words, they were basically on the right path when they decided that these categories are primarily defined by time occasion. In other words, this is the music we do for this particular time at this particular occasion, and this is the music we do for another. And by the way, not the text. The text is secondary, because the same Kaddish will say it in one way in Sukkot in the morning, and one time on Shabbat in the afternoon, etc. So the primary classification was time occasion. Right away, there is also a problem. And it's, again, I'm not going to develop it, but it really, it affects all discourse until really, really, really late, which is all of these ideas, including late discourse, had this idea, even again, they did not, maybe they haven't questioned it, but the assumption was that this can be systematized under one governing principle. I can already say that it's not. But again, once you think everything should sort of apply to one particular principle, by the way, it's a very modern concept, but postmodernism helps us with this. So for example, even that classification by time and occasion does not cover the entire repertoire and the entire framework. There's some places that there is a different classification. I'm just giving it as an example that it cannot obey the same principle. But so those are almost like side comments to keep in mind. What I think is the absolute key, both to how we see it and both to see where the problem started, is a term, which was actually not that common in general, but it was very common and very prevalent and significant in theoretical discourse, and that's Steiger. Right away, we have a problem, because of the meaning of the term Steiger, and I am looking at the term. It's not a problem. First of all, it shows us, again, how they were ahead of their time in their thinking, because Steiger, this is from, before I go into the dictionary, Steiger in other dictionaries basically mean the way in which we do things, the manner in which we do things, style. For example, in Yiddish, we can Lebenssteiger, oh, my German accent, Lebenssteiger, is the way of life, just how we live, the manner in which we live, or style. Moderne Steiger, the modern way of doing. And here are some things in the dictionary from Harkavi. First of all, it's interesting. So Steiger is the manner, and often derech, in other words, this is in Hebrew, way of doing. And immediately the first meaning is negina, tune, call, how we sing, tune, melody. That's, of course, very relevant, but we also have to see other things. Wieder Steiger uns, as customary, as usual. Kaminhag, the way things are done. Stellen auf ein Steiger, the right way to do it, or the right path. Halten auf Steiger, he got to the right place. And Zongensteiger, whatever, I may not pronounce it. That's important because it even covers to sing extemporaneously. In other words, to sing without preparation. A Steiger, for instance, etc. Basically, okay, so all of those things imply that Steiger basically is the way we do things, which, of course, or the manner in which we do things, it covers basically, again, this whole framework. And yes, it also verges, again, terms are context sensitive, it's a fuzzy issue. Yes, the word nusach sort of covers that too, and even mode. I just want to get rid of one thing. I'm not going to get into nusach now. It's an insider term. There are a whole bunch of different interpretations of what people think it is, different definitions and arguments, and there is no point at this point. What I can say is even the process that I'm doing now, in other words, trying to find accurate definitions and terminology for one phenomena, it affects those discussions as well. But I'm going to leave it at that for now. We can do a whole other session about what nusach is, taking into account this theory. Mode is perfectly fine too, but mode, again, it led to some trouble because mode is very inclusive. You can basically say anything that a way of doing things. Let's say in English, outside of music, mode is how we do things, and that's fine. The problem is once we start to blur the meaning between the dictionary meaning and what mode means in musical discourse. We'll run into it a little bit, but that's later on. So, in the way they were thinking, they were ahead of the times because the way they see Steiger is how we can now, in the 21st century, we view a lot of music that's outside of Western common practice. We view it as the way it's done things. It's not just a particular theoretical item. It's a whole framework in which things connect to each other and not including things outside of music. The problem is they were not ahead of their times because that is probably the word they chose, but they did not have the theoretical discourse to deal with it. And so the discrepancy between what they thought and what they presented in the theoretical discourse is where we start to get into trouble, because regardless of what the term means, when they presented theoretical discourse, the entire system was basically a system of scales. And again, under one principle, scales will cover everything, and they call the Steigers, the scale Steigers. But again, the scales that prevent they call Steigers regardless of what it could really mean. And so what we run into, and again, first those scales, and again, forget now, Steiger means that, but in theory it was just scales. And the first I guess default was to view them not necessarily as major and minor, although that was the case as well, but mostly as what I call similar or identical to the pseudo-Greek modes. When I say pseudo-Greek modes, I'm using a term by Powers, but basically it means to our high school, conservatory, whatever, oversimplified approach in which, you know, the whites on the piano from D to D is Dorian, from E to E is Phrygian, etc. In fact, this modal system is much more involved than that, but that's what they went for. Part of it was also era. First of all, they did not have any other theoretical tools by which to do it. Secondly, it was basically also a zeitgeist. Don't forget that the rest of Europe also, when they viewed theory, it was basically the main building block was a scale. And there was the whole idea of Volksgeist and the awareness of nationality that started in the 19th century, Herder, etc. So the idea that if we want to express the expression of the folk in music, we go to modes. And what are modes? Dorian, Phrygian, including, etc. So the first thing we run is...
Would you like to share the Friedman scores now?
Oh, does that mean that we are behind time?
No, maybe you just want to show...
I'll do it in a second. Okay. Yes, we'll go to Friedman. But the point is that first they really show equivalent to the church, to the Greek modes. Sometimes they call it church modes. There are all sorts of other reasons: ideology, self-image, and outside image, etc. All those things are in an article. I get to a bibliography later. But there were reasons that this happened, and from all sorts of different angles. They were also exposed to the theory of just regular theory in Europe, because let's not forget, as Jeffrey Goldberg says, the cantorial schools at that time were actually run by the German government, and so they were exposed to outside concepts, but it was all the idea of that. We hear the term Kirchentonart in Weintraub in 1959, but the first time we hear Steiger as a system of scales, some of them are different, is in a paper by Joseph Zenger from 1886, in which he presents the Steiger system, which are basically 3 scales, etc. But then from that, we also run into a whole bunch of different scales that are called Steiger. Sometimes they're just the same as the Greek mode. Sometimes they're a little different. For example, it's not unusual to run into what we call now Adonai Malach, and they call it Mixolydian, because they look at the octave and the lowered 7. Or the classic thing is Ava by Phrygish. In other words, it has to do with Phrygian. And again, I really try to discourage people from using that insider terminology because it's not related to the Phrygian, it's related to something else. Okay, so now we'll move into, I'll have to do a new share because this is not a picture. One document that's very interesting to look at, and there's going to be another phenomenon that you will run into right away as we do, is the cantorial book. They wrote manuscripts. Aaron Friedman was one of the major theoreticians at the time. He also wrote the whole book, and actually the articles that appeared in that collection he edited, etc. But it's an interesting thing because inside his wait, am I sharing it or did I forget?
It's not shared. It's not shared yet.
Okay, sorry, I forgot to do that. Okay, this is a page from his manuscript. In his manuscript, he wrote, music for everything. Here we see Shacharit Limot HaChol. But what's interesting is that on top of several sections, he actually used some kind of a theoretical title. It's not really explained, but we can see here, for example, that on top of this Yigdal for Chol, he uses the term Skala der Morgen Ovus Weise in parentheses tonat. I'm not going to try to translate all these things. They mean specific things, etc. The important thing are two things. First of all, look at the title, Skala der Morgen Ovus Weise tonat, and what it is. It's a minor scale. It takes one octave. It's just an octave species of the natural minor, D to D with the B flat. And underneath that, there is all sorts of material. I'm not going to analyze it right now. But if we move further down, and I'm going to have just a few, here is now, this is another Magen Avot, but this one is Magen Avos Weise. Not Skala de Avot Tonat, Magen Avos Weise. And still, the example, one octave species of natural minor. Underneath that, there is all sorts of music. I looked at it. Those things sometimes have things in common, but it doesn't really have much in common in terms of the content of the music or its conduct with the other category. Let's look at a few more. This is, now again, Magen Avot Weise for the Kaddish, for the Torah reading. Varabel Weise. Varabel Tonart. I guess different from Weise, but again, the same scale. Skala der Magen Avos Weise Tonart again. And I think we got the point. It's all over. Magen Avos Tonart now. So two things that I can see. Skala der Magen Avos Weise Tonart. What we can see is two things. First of all, he looks at Magen Avot as a scale. He gives it different titles, and they change from one case to another, but we don't really know why. And one of the important things, and that's going to affect everything from here on, what we can see here is what I call a tendency for over-inclusivity. In other words, under the category of Magen Avot, a lot of repertoire, this is just a few examples, it's throughout the entire book. He has all sorts of different sections of music that he puts under Magen Avot. As I said, he calls Magen Avot with different terms that he doesn't explain. And basically, so we have a huge receptacle of music that doesn't really share much with each other. It just could be everything. And they're all called Magen Avot. What I can say for now, perhaps the only thing that they do have in common is that one octave species minor scale. So at this point, we still don't have anything that helps us understand this, let alone as a Steiger, which is a whole system. All we have is a scale, and as a scale, it might as well cover everything. We don't know what certain other things in minor are not there. For that matter, we don't know why Mozart Requiem should not be included because it's in B minor. But intuitively, we know that there is something else going on there that's not just a scale, but the theory was unable to actually express it, let alone take it into account.
Okay, so maybe we'll take a little break here.
Yeah.
So we'll let Boaz take a breath. So what you see so far is that the common thing that's by the beginning of the 20th century, what we have at hand is we have a practice, we have a tradition, and the theoretical talk about it is basically uses the term Steiger, but is basically a group of scales using common and familiar terms, but it's not really clear what they are telling us about the way the music works. So what we're going to do now, we're going to go over the four main theoreticians or writers about the theory of the Ashkenazi music who tried to phrase in one way or another how this system works. We're going to try to see what went wrong in their attempts. What are those wrong turns that Boaz mentioned, and how those seeds of misconception or inaccuracies grow further into going basically astray from creating a comprehensive theory. After this deconstruction, next week at this time, or actually one hour later, right, Geraldine? We're going to go back to the regular schedule. So the next time we're going to look on the positive note how to reconstruct what we could do in order to understand how this system works, and redefine maybe the term Steiger. So that will be next week. So what we're going to look at now are the four sources, writers, actually. So it will be Edelson, what he writes about the system of Steigers in his book from 1929, Jewish Music, Its Historical Development, and what he writes in the introduction to the 7th volume of the Thesaurus of Ashkenazi Music. Then we're going to look into some of the work of Eric Werner. Well, he had various publications from the 40s until the 70s in the 20th century. Then we're going to address what Neil Levine tried to do in his book from 1989, The Synagogue Song in America. And to wrap it up, we'll see how we can read under these conception, how we can read Baruch Cohen's article from 1950 about the structure of the synagogue prayer. Boaz, can you take on from here?
Yeah, I just want to actually add, yes, what we're doing now, I guess, is a process of deconstruction. But one of the things, first of all, next week, yes, presumably after we deconstruct it, we can build it up then and try to catch back on the initial intentions using tools that we now have. But the whole idea here is that by actually trying to figure out, first of all, what the problem is, and secondly, what went wrong, or where are all those deep diversions that they took, this saves us time, because then we know what we need to do. We know what to try to avoid, and we know what needs fixing and how to go about it, and also identify conceptual mistakes. For example, yes, Steiger has to the theory has to include all these things that scales do not. Now, what we are also finding now is, again, not just it's confusing, but so far, and I'm only taking Magen Avot as a model, we don't really get anything. We just get scales, and again, and what is part of the mode and what is not clear. When it comes to Edelson, several things change. First of all, Edelson is actually, so far as we know, formally is the first one who actually claims that in addition to scales, we also have some kind of a motivic aspect, some kind of a melodic. There's something in which the notes are organized. It's not just a scale. Motifs call it, phrases call it, whatever you want. I just want to note that the 19th century sources did sometimes analyze motifs, etc., but they never really included them as part of the definition of the mode. It's like they analyze it just like Mozart's sonata. In other words, they did not really make the connection that the F major sonata, that the motifs there are actually part of what the F major is, which is not, but in our system it may. But Edelson started with, yes, there are motifs or some kind of melodic fragments, etc. Of course, this was part of his dealing with Makam, the Arab music, and there are some scholars that I don't want to mention that actually claim that even his understanding of Makam was sort of questionable. the point is that there was something new. Okay, not just scale motifs. The other thing that sort of replaced it, the paradigm, is that while they were trying to look at the Greek modes or church, Edelson basically put that all in the framework of the Arab maqam. Well, there were several reasons for that, and I guess I'll only mention three because they're crucial. In Edelson's agenda, he had three main programmatic assumptions. That first of all, that all Jewish music is the same. In other words, the German, Ashkenazi, Iraqi, Yemenite, Moroccan, it's all basically the same. He wanted to show that they're all sort of the same. So the theory has to sort of be the same theory, it has to cover them as the same thing. As such, it all connects to time of antiquity, preferably Beit HaMikdash, but as we'll see, even the biblical, even though I don't even think he really believed it, but he wanted to wrap it up with an aura of antiquity. And the third thing, they all came from the Middle East, Levantine, etc. Needless to say, all these three parts, they sort of serve each other. I mean, if they all came from the same origin, they're all the same. If they're from the time of antiquity, they have to be from the Middle East, from Jerusalem, etc. The problem that immediately, and again, we won't cover everything, I just want to look at two examples. Because of this, again, it contributes to, it sort of undermines this whole idea of motifs and other things. First of all, before even we start, we know that even the scales, we cannot, maqam, even the scalar system is not the same. It's not the tuning system. And also it behaves in a different way from the way Steigers behave. And we know it sounds different. But I want to share an example of something that Edelson does, in which we see how the desire for it to be the same and to be from the East, etc., really takes over some things and, again, results in real unclarity of what this mode is. Now it's going to just run smoothly because
I think you should.
Hold on. Yes, we're here. Come on. Okay. This is a page from his 1929 book, Jewish Music in its historical development. And here he shows us an example when he discusses Magen Avot. This is a Magen Avot example. Now, what do we see here? I'll get into the details. But first of all, we see two sections. They're both his examples from Magen Avot. We can immediately see that there is an Ashkenazic version and a Sephardic Oriental, whatever that means. Let me actually, I wonder if we can make it a little larger. I'll make it larger in a minute. Now, if we look at the Ashkenazi, first of all, I guess it disturbs me something here. Okay, I'll sing it and you'll immediately see something. מגן אבות בדברו, מחיי מתים במאמרו, האל הקדוש שאין כמוהו, המניח לעמו ביום שבת קודשו, כי בם רצה להניח להם. Okay, some of us recognize this, but to our surprise, he stops it here and then he presents something else. He adds this. Ta-da-da-da-da-da-dum, ta-da-da-da-da-da. In other words, we know that, so I guess some of us can recognize that this is a Lewandowski setting from Magen Avot. It even says congregation. It's in D minor, we can see, natural minor. It's sort of, it's Western in its conduct. I mean, there is a sort of a periodic, there is a structure, there is symmetry, it's conducive to congregational singing. It's a tune in the Western sense of it, but he stops it here in order to show us these guys, and these guys eventually, and this gun will shoot later, but he puts that in order to show Ta'amei Mikra, to show biblical cantillations. So first of all, he forces something on the source. he takes the Lewandowski tune and then he adds that. But the things that are more apparent is what he does is the idea that he includes both settings under the same category. Because this one, I guess I can sing it sort of, it has this recitation tone. So if we had to categorize this in the same way that the other one is a sort of symmetrical tune, it's regularized, it's in minor, it's rhythmic, like the rhythm, never mind how he writes it, it can be put into like measures, etc. What we have here is basically one primary recitation tone, a lot of recitation on one note, and in between some kind of melismatic elaborations. So in terms of even the conduct, it behaves differently. Moreover, if we can say that the top is D minor, this is some sort of a G, maybe G melodic minor if we were going to implement Western theory on it. But anyway, it shows that there is really nothing that they really have in common so far as motivic behavior, tonal behavior, even recitation versus melisma, etc. One more thing that really sticks out is that in his desire to make it the same thing, he gives them the same key signature. But that's misleading, because if this is sort of a G, then this is G minor. He just doesn't put the E flat there. And in the D he gives, so it gives us the illusion that they're even the same scale in terms of key signature. Again, the outcome of all this is that if this is Magen Avot, I don't know how to define it. There is nothing that I can hang on to that's typical, that they both share, etc. There's just too many things inside this one category, not only tonality, but motivically and how it behaves, etc. I'm going to go into just one more example in terms of Edelson, but because one of the other things that Edelson had in mind is, wait, I have to reduce it, is that to find evidence that this is old, and in Jewish repertoire we don't have so many examples, the idea is that the older the music, the more traces it has left in all sorts of other repertoires. So the next thing is to try to see Adonai and Magen Avot traits in a whole bunch of, first of all, Jewish music, but outside of the West, a lot of folk songs, Christian songs, hymns, even Mendelssohn art song. He also had a Hatikva thing that he had to put it in there, and therefore Yigdal, etc. The only question is, why can't I go forward with this thing? See, I don't, okay. I'll have to stop the share and open something else. The way I planned it was to have one thing that just moves from one example to the other. I hope it's going to work next. Just a second. Okay, I see that it doesn't work either. I mean, I'll have to just do it in between examples. Here is something from the introduction to volume 7 of the Thesaurus. It's Ashkenazi. Again, I did not really mean to show the text. I just want to say the good examples. But we can even see here that he's comparing it to Arabic Bayat Maqam. He is comparing it to Spanish folk songs, to some slicha somewhere. He's known, there is evidence by the pilgrims in their pilgrimage in Spain, Mendelssohn, Winter Song, Mein Sohn, etc. This is, he had a whole bunch of examples, especially in an article that I'm not going to cover, the Magen Avot Mode, in which he brings about 25, 26 different sources, different musics, to show that somehow all of this is Magen Avot. What I'm showing here is how it actually affects his attempt of actually extracting some motifs. And so what we see here, I don't want to analyze all of them right now. Some of them are familiar. What I want to show first is the ones that are really atypical and why they're there. The striking is number 5, because it goes like this. This does not compute with Magen Avot the way we hear it. There is, yes, it goes to the relative major. Magen Avot does that too, but not this way. It's not even a motif. It's hard to figure out what motif we can extract from it. It's a little phrase. Even this number 6, not really, especially the way it goes up to the octave. Number 7, granted, it all sounds Jewish, it all sounds familiar, but this is not what Magen Avot does. For example, Magen Avot never really ends on the 8th degree. If it ends on the tonic, so to speak, it will be on 1, and most of the times it ends on the 5. And this leading tone is also a question. Some of the things, I don't want to go into all of this, but basically we see things that do not match what Magen Avot is. And again, I have to say, some of it I'm speaking from next week because I've already tried to explore in a certain way how Magen Avot behaves. And another thing here, a puzzle on 4, Magen Avot doesn't do it, never. It pauses on 5, it pauses on 1. The point that I want to say is that by showing us these motifs that again sort of don't compute and create sort of confusion, they don't match the material, etc. What they do match, they match all these other sources that he wanted to see to show that they're equivalent to. So again, the idea of trying to go into the agenda to make it old, to make it even makam, to make it, I guess, although this doesn't serve Middle Eastern, this agenda takes over the motifs. The motifs might match the comparative aspect that he wants to do, but it doesn't match the actual material in which we see Magen Avot. So again, I guess I'm leading into so now, but the point is that 2 things. First of all, even though he formally acknowledged that there are motifs, when he starts to discuss the fact as an outcome of all these other programmatic ideas, we are left with the same situations that we were before. In other words, it's basically all sorts of things, it's not really clear, and all they have in common is the minor scale. There is one more thing that I'm not going to show in Edelson, but I'm going to mention his idea of what we call the mode of the prophet. In other words, and this is where mode comes into the picture, because in theory, you can also call Ta'amei HaMikra a mode. It would fit the musicological concept. So he actually talked about the Haftorah Ta'amim as the mode of the prophet. And he starts with this, and in his discussion, he first identified Magen Avot and mode of the prophet, and then both in the example and in the narrative, he claims them to be the same thing. In other words, Magen Avot is the mode of the prophet, and Magen Avot, we can see it by all sorts of ta'amim from the Haftarah. I think that even the term mode of the prophet takes it to the Bible, which he didn't mean, but also it gives him the idea that that Ta'amei HaMikra affected Nusach, and there was also the sort of illusion that Ta'amei HaMikra, we have evidence from earlier periods, so they can sort of help us show the connection to antiquity. I don't want to get into the fact that they're not that old, but again, the outcome is what Magen Avot and the Haftarah have in common is the minor scale. The whole idea of finding time. I'll let you, I know what you're going to say. I want you to say it, but I just want to say that this idea of finding Ta'amei HaMikra as the basis for Nusach and those connections, from here on, it will really sort of overcome a lot of the theoretical discourse. Amalia, the difference between Ta'amim and Nusach.
Yeah, no, we are a little bit short of time, so I just want to make the point. If you think about Ta'amei HaMikra and Nusach and Tfilah that is guided by the Steiger, we're talking about 2 different phenomena here, whereas both of them support the delivery of a text orally. But when we talk about Ta'amei HaMikra, we have a set of motifs, and they are limited in their use. They are set in a framework of a pasuk, of a verse, which will always end in the same way, with the same motif, even if you're very creative reader and you can play with the sof pasuk and do it a little bit differently. As a modal framework, it works in a very, very strict rules and rather restrained. No much place for improvisation, because what you want now is basically to deliver the text clearly, and you want to have the syntax very clear and the stresses in the right place. So the musical motifs here, they have a very important function, of course, because even if you don't understand the text, you hear the mode and you know if once you stepped into the synagogue, are they doing Torah reading or Haftarah reading or Megillah, and which Megillah? So of course the music has a meaning, but the motifs themselves, even if you don't understand the text, you know a verse has ended. And if a reader will not read correctly the end of the verse, then he will be corrected in order to have the text delivered well. And of course, we're talking about very small motifs, so it's not surprising to find them when you have basically the same musical scale, whether it be it minor or major or whatever. It's not surprising to find them in the prayer as well, but they work, they function in a completely different way. And if you isolate a motif, when you do it in the context of laning, of reading the Torah in tropes, then you have one thing in your hand. And if you isolate the same motif from a flow of text, of an extemporation of a mode, of a steiger during the tefillah, during the prayer, you're actually holding a different item. Yeah, you have something else, and you have to look at the context of that motif in order to understand how it works within the mode, within the steiger, which is different from the way it works in the tropes.
I just want to add.
We were going to go on now to Werner, who has continued basically the line of Edelson, but also tried to do a few other things. Boaz.
Hold on for a second. First of all, let me just reiterate something. When we talk about Ta'amei HaMikra, we have to realize that we have tens of traditions, if not more, and sub-traditions. So in each tradition we have 26, maybe more or less, little motifs. So basically, if we want to find Ta'amei HaMikra, we have at our disposal a huge receptacle of hundreds of little motifs. Some of them are very simple and universal. So yeah, it is possible to find something from out of this and find it in the Nusach, and that actually you'll see how it gets into the extreme with Joseph Levine. A protocol thing. To me, it looks like we have 20-something more minutes, right?
More or less, yeah.
Plenty of time. Don't rush. Just carry on.
No, it's okay. But no, I'm just saying that, Amalia, to reassure you, I think we're fine. But I wonder if I should. Okay, I'm going to go over Werner very quickly, because Werner, basically, of course, after Edelson, he basically in his writing repeats Edelson's idea, including the fact that we have motifs, not just scale, and again the comparative. His main agenda was more trying to make comparison with early church. That his comparative agenda was more towards that. But again, both the Arab thing as well and antiquity and all of that. I also want to say for the record that Werner is highly controversial in general. We have at least 5 or 6 reviews that very well and articulately show the mistakes that he has. Some people think it's omissions deliberate, something is just mistakes. The best one is by Peter Jeffrey. And so in general, Werner was trying to do something impossible, because he was trying to do something that takes 10 or 15 different scholars to cover in different fields. But he had an agenda, etc. The only thing that I'm going to do sort of quickly is to follow 3 stages in his, again, the musical examples of what he thinks the mode is in terms of music. here again. Okay, there we go. These are examples from 3 different places. One of them is an article that he wrote for a collection of essays. I have the title somewhere, but let's leave it alone. The other one is from A Voice Still Heard, and one of them is from actually a manual that he wrote from synagogue musicians. And so what we see here, and again, it's not necessarily a development, but we see 3 different examples. I'm just moving something here that I see, then you don't. Okay, so the first one is a skeleton Magen Avot mode. What do we see? We basically see a scale. We see a scale with 2 different turns, and another skip, and another scale. So it's really not that far remote from just being a scale, let alone motifs or anything else. We really don't have anything there. We have a scale and something here that he doesn't actually explain, but it's sort of a shift. It's really, you can see that it's very far from any motivic description. In the second example, we see a little bit of a development because at least we see what may be a differentiation between structural notes and less structural notes. The whole notes, I guess, are more structural and these one are not. But again, not a lot more, and still scale here, and I guess, yeah, the turns are a little bit more elaborate than here, but basically, again, we don't see motifs and we basically see a scale. The last example is a little bit better. Is a little bit more evolved, but we'll see. Here we have, at least he sort of gives us little boxes. I mean, we have this motif, that, this, and that. So it's a little bit more. We see also different, again, I don't know if he meant rhythmical patterns. Here it looks like it might. Here it may be just notes that are a little less important. But when we look at it, what do we see? We see a scale. This is going from 1 to 5. We see 1 pentachord of a scale. Here we basically see a jump, but what's left is a scale. Scalar, I mean, it's a pentachord, but it's a scalar element. The same thing here, the same thing here, and the same thing here. So the outcome of all of Werner's discourse, regardless of what he says, which is very similar to Ilson, but we are left, again, just with a minor scale as the definition. And this, so now I want to move into Joseph Levine, because as few things that happened, that were planted here, sort of explode in Joseph Levine example. I'm skipping Glantz. I think Jerry Glantz is here because we don't have time, but I just wanted, for the record, Glantz basically saw everything in terms of scales. He knew their motifs, and he had an argument with Wahlberg, but he himself did not really mention motif. He was more invested in showing scalar, again, especially because this is a scale that he thinks covers a lot of different repertoire, but it has 3 different stages, either this, or both of them, or all of them together. And here, again, I don't want to explain why, but he sort of forces Mixolydian on this tune. And here I want to say, just the Hebrew, see, he say, me Phrygish. And in English, or whatever, Phrygian. Otherwise, again, back to this model. In general, okay, so Glantz had a lot of other things that he wanted to express in his theory. There's an article on that too. It will be in the bibliography, but I'm skipping that for now because I want to show a few things in Joseph Levine. Joseph Levine, his process is, again, both the Makam and the Tamei Mikra, how we combine it both to Adonai Malach. And so here in the example, you see Middle Eastern equivalents and biblical parallels for Magen Avot mode. So, first he gives us an Arabic tune in Bayat Nawah, and it goes like this. Excuse my westernized performance of what probably would have performed differently. The question that I'm not looking for an answer right now, but to yourselves think, does it resemble anything that you can recognize in what would be a Magen Avot mode? Does it sound like anything on Friday night, etc.? And then he wants to sort of view it from the other side, in other words, to show how it's Tamei Mikra. So I guess what he's doing is comparing this tune to this Ta'amei HaMikra collection. I'm not going to sing them because you probably know them, but you can see that basically he's trying to follow, and maybe he has a point to some degree. But what happens here systematically? He shows 4 different traditions of Ta'amei HaMikra: Lithuanian, Babylonian, Lithuanian 3, and Ashkenazi. Ashkenazi is basically West Europe, Lithuanian is East, whatever. And so, again, not only you can choose a lot of things, he takes different ta'amim from different traditions, not necessarily in the order in which they will appear when we read it. And so we get this. We get Lithuanian Merchati Pecha, we get Lithuanian Munachat Nachta, and I think it's from Shir HaShirim, we're not sure. We have Kadma Ve'azla all of a sudden, but it's from Iraqi. And again, from Lithuanian, we have Miperta and Darga. By the way, Darga, no Tevir after that. And then Ashkenazi and Ashkenazi. So what we get maybe resemble the Makam, but again, which we don't sure it resembles Adonai Magen Avot. But again, it's really just cherry-picking different Ta'amei HaMikra to show this similarity. But then what happens next is this, because from then he moves to show us motifs from how the Ta'amei HaMikra help us with the motifs, because what he goes here, he takes the setting of Me'en Sheva of Be'er. That's on the top, it's from Be'er Me'en Sheva, and on the bottom he gives us Ta'amei HaMikra. But the Ta'amei HaMikra that he gives us here are not the ones in the previous example. Here he chooses other ones, and again he chooses from different sources and different, even different from Haftarah, from Megillat Esther, from other places. So again, what happens?
Perhaps you can enlarge it a little bit more, so we can see the different sources. You can see that each motif comes from a different source.
And a different tradition, and sometimes a different occasion. So again, he takes and it seems very sort of similar to the altar, to Be'er, but again, these are different from, in other words, we cannot connect the Makam and the Te'amim to the Be'er, because every time it's different Te'amim, and again, the Te'amim are like an assorted from different places. I just want to make another comment that choosing this setting by Be'er is also a problem, because we'll see next week when we view a lot of sources, we actually see that of all things, this one is not a good representation of the mode. Every source has some places where it goes away, where it does something atypical. So he takes one source, atypical, attaches a combination of different ta'amim from different places, and from that, presumably we're going to get the motifs and the outcome. And I also have 2 different examples, but I only have one here, but it will make the point, is that the Magen Avot motifs that we're left is this huge amount of different phrases. Some of them are actually pretty long. Some of them, and again, they have all sorts of different notes. I don't know if it's motif or a phrase. We're very confused about, is this Magen Avot?
What you see now in front of you really is the notes of the entire paragraph of Magen Avot, basically sliced into motifs, what he calls motifs. But right. You have the entire kind of tune here of through composed of the entire.
Right. In other words, let me repeat. He takes one particular version and he just divides it into smaller sections, and those are the motifs. What we know, and again, last week, we can even, from whatever we know already, there is a way too much, they're way too large. A lot of this doesn't sound familiar in terms of Magen Avot, and again, we're left with lack of clarity still what Magen Avot is. And again, what we're left with is a scale, and even that, not necessarily, because we have A flat. Is the A flat or E flat just 4 notes? Are they part of the mode itself? If that's part of a motif, then yes. It's very blurry. And again, if we try to take all sorts of Magen Avot settings and try to impose this on them, it will not match. Okay, so from here, I want to go.
Before you move to Baruch Cohen, I want to make one little comment, and that's because I understand there are a lot of practitioners here and teachers and people who use this terminology, I think it's just important to understand again that we're talking this recursive process that Boaz is talking about is when you take as a starting point the fact that Magen Avot, for example, is a term being used and we refer to it and we use it, and then when the questions come, wait, but Shacharit Shabbat, well, it's also Magen Avot, but it doesn't work exactly like Friday night. It's not exactly like the passage Magen Avot. So what's going on here? So the process is to take a whole variety of sources, which is what Boaz does in his theoretical work, on the basis of which he can say, for example, that Joe, I just realized I said Neil before. So Joe Levine's example here is not a typical example, because once you explore sources from 19th century music anthologies of cantors and manuscripts and also texts from the 20th century, you see where you have a typical Magen Avot passage, and that will not fit. That will not be a typical one. But we start from what the field, like what every ethnomusicologist would do. We start from the field, even if your field is, as you said, dead informants who only left us with their notes, but they defined Magen Avot in a certain way based on what they practiced and what they composed and what was around them. And when you have this whole variety of sources, then you can start checking, is there a creature called Magen Avot? And what we're doing now is really understand why these sources, they're not the four theoreticians I saw Charles Heller mentioning here, but they are main sources that I can say about myself with sources that I've read along the years as a student and then as a researcher and from my teachers. They are being quoted again and again and again, and they are used as sources for people to understand what are these modes. And if somebody needs to give a lecture about the Steiger and how the Ashkenazi versus the Makam or not versus the Makam, these sources continue to be quoted. And that's why it's important to understand some of the problematics with the way these musical phenomena are defined, because they're not really defined.
Yeah, I want to sort of stress something that you said, and I forgot to say in the beginning, because what we're doing here, what I'm doing here, is another recursive process. In other words, if maybe you didn't know, I didn't even notice when I did it, but basically I went on the assumption, what is Magen Avot? Magen Avot is what all these people say it is. So let's go and check what they say, and as we go, maybe we'll have to adjust something or correct something, and what I see is basically if I take what it is, it's basically one big receptacle of a whole bunch of things, a whole bunch of different motifs, yes, no, and it's all one scale. So obviously I have to do the recursive and take it back somewhere from which to sort of start to rebuild. Again, while the sources, I have to say, some of your musicologists or teachers or whatever, I am really discouraged by the fact that I read papers and I see them, people still, all they have to base their stuff on is Edelson, maybe Werner, maybe Baruch Cohen, etc., and they're not aware of that all these sources these days are only read critically. They're part of a historiography, not material on which to base. And there's a whole bunch of work that was done afterwards, which I guess people are not aware of, and it's chaval, especially because if there are things you get to wrong conclusions because you're basing yourself on sources that are questionable or that they have problem. I'm moving to, and yeah, apropos, I'm moving to the Baruch Cohen. I'm moving here because there are two issues here. First, the problem, and secondly, maybe a hint about how to take it. But I'm also saying it because for some reason it's the most dominant scholarly work that's in the field. I mean, we even discussed it here a few times at JTS with HCG, at HUC. HUC has a textbook of exercises. The exercises are great, but all they're based on Baruch Cohen article. And we have to start reading it critically, again, in order to be able to rebuild. So I'm going to, let's just say, let's just look at this a little bit, and I'm going to enlarge it. He, first of all, in the beginning of the article, he takes the trouble to say, modes are not scales. And the example is relatively simply, he gives you some kind of a tune, and in other words, modes have some kind of a melodic content or motivic content. In other words, there's something, not just the scales, but what the scales do. So let's say motifs. But then he discusses four modes. I'm not going to go to all of them, but when it comes to Magen Avot, he presents you this Magen Avot table. And I'm enlarging it, but I'm not going to go in details. But if we see, first of all, he divides them into different groups, A, B, C, D, etc. But from a bird's eye view, what we can see is that each one of those groups are completely different motifs. I'm not going to go into the details. Some of them do seem the same. There's also, I think, a problem because he defines them by phrases. These are variants. We don't know what's a variant. We don't know what's a motif. We don't know what's a new motif or a variant. But the most important thing is that each one of these groups under Magen Avot has different motifs. I'll go into the details of what they are in a minute. But the point is that he sort of, on one hand, he declares that the modes are not defined by their scales, but by their motifs. But if they're defined by their motifs, then each one of them is a different mode. We can't call them Magen Avot. Each one give it another name. But this one is one mode, this is another, because the motifs are what count, and they're different in each one. What do they all have in common? The minor scale. And he doesn't have it in the example, but so he calls it mode under the Magen Avot scale. And the point is that none of them, you can't put them under Magen Avot. You can choose one of them if you want. But if the difference and defining factor of modes is motifs, each one of them is a separate mode. So far as scale is concerned, and I'm going to go over Adonai Malach 2 because it's relevant even so far as a scale, but I want to point out that even as a scale, there is one error here. Again, you can see they're all sort of D minor, although there's some, but when we look at what he called tefillah mode, we know that one. This is really not a...
Can you enlarge it, Boaz? Can you enlarge it a little bit? It's not legible.
This is tefillah mode, and basically is the mode we use for the repetition of the Amidah during weekday. I sang it already, but basically we know it really, it's important not to impose a scale on it, because this is really what we call pentatonic. It behaves like a pentatonic. It's not really imposing a minor scale on it. That's so far as scales are concerned. But I want to add it, even so far as scales move to his example of Adonai Malach, which is a little bit more problematic. Again, I don't have all the examples. When I looked at Adonai Malach, I did a different process. I said, let's go and look at everything that has that scale in it and then see what goes on. But when we look at these motifs, again, we have the same problem that each one, he gives us different groups, and each one of them is different motifs. So again, I could say, fine, each one of those is a different mode, but they cannot be considered Adonai Malach mode, because presumably all they have in common is a scale, and a scale does not define the mode. This is his starting point. Moreover, even if we think about a scale, and let's say that Magen Avot scale, and that we'll cover next week, it's not exactly, but let's say it's like a C major with a B flat and an A flat above the octave, even that doesn't work, because here he thinks everything is on C, fine, and therefore we have a B flat in the key signature, fine, we have a minor 7, and we want an E flat, but every time we see an E flat, it's natural, and a B flat is natural, and all we see, so we never really see the scale. And the truth is, this is for Shabbat morning, it's all fine, but it's not Adonai Malach, it's actually just major. Even here, again, you put the key signature of B flat, but when we have an E, it's natural. We have another B somewhere that's natural, and here. So again, this is not, even as a scale, it's not Adonai Malach, it's major. The same thing we can see here in the high holidays, E natural, B natural. So the key signature may be Mixolydian, but the notes are just major. Here there is another problem. This is for Akdamut. And I'll sing the beginning, we sort of know it. Akdamut milim v'sharayut shita, v'lashaklana harmanu shuta. Here there's another problem. The key signature is not C with the low 7, because this is actually F major. The fact that we start on the 5 and end with the 5 doesn't mean that the tonic is not F. So here it's, again, not Adonai Malach. It's definitely major, but even the tonic or the key signature is misidentified. And so this is more or less when we're left with all sorts of other things. But again, what happens is that we are left in 1950. Cohen is 1950. We even have things as late as 1989, but I think that's already sort of an anachronism. But so what we're left again is just basically what the 19th century source is this. We have a scale, and we have a whole bunch of different things that are thrown in it, but none of them we can actually figure out anything in terms of motivic structure or how it behaves or how it's part of this whole framework. One thing about Cohen that we can say, though, is that he does take us full circle to the beginning, and I'm going back to the Magen Avot, because what he does have is a taxonomical system. He has a categorization, and lo and behold, the typology is by time and occasion. We have Brachot HaShachar, we have Tefillah mode for weekday, we have Magen Avot for Friday night, we have, Baruch Hu mode, etc. In other words, although we have to say, we can't look at all these things as Magen Avot. Each one of them is a separate mode, but he does go back to the idea that the primary typology of this taxonomy is by time and event. And I think the way I went about it, this is the starting point for reconstructing it to something that could sort of match the original meaning of what they meant when they say Steiger. In other words, it's a framework of reference, maybe a system that contains a lot of different, not just, of course, modes and scales and all sorts of different patterns and connections to text and to choreography and to time, all of those things. But I think that the starter is to take Cohen's idea, and I'll tell you on what we focus and how we rebuild it back to, again, something that will also take us back to the original idea of Schneider, which these days we have the tools to deal with. But again, like Amalia said, and you can maybe sum it up, because even today, yes, in the schools, when we say Magen Avot, nobody has a clue of what that really means, or they have different ideas of what it means, and sometimes they say, the Amida for Rosh Hashanah is Magen Avot, the Yishtabach on Shabbat is Magen Avot, the Friday night, etc., and each one of them is actually different, and we're left with confusion on one hand, and lack of a system still, even though we have enough reason to think that there is a theory and that there is more to it than just scales. That's what I have to say. If Amalia wants to say something, and then we can go to Q&A.
Well, I think you summed it up beautifully. I really hope this will be taken as a call for discussion and as material for thought, mainly for whoever talks theory about Jewish music, because Ashkenazi music is, in this sense, is a little bit backwards. I mean, you can't talk about it just like you do on Makam, that every Shabbat or every Tefillah has its own mode, and it's very clear, and we can show it in class, and whether it's a school of cantors or music academy students or whoever wants to learn anything about the system. So it's worthwhile, and it's very interesting how, well, at least the almost 25 years that I've been following this issue, it has not taken ground yet. The fact that the theory that we're all discussing and using, this terminology, is not clear. And whenever we use it, we always have to make some adjustments and amendments. And I hope what Boaz does and this either this group or any other groups that discuss and maybe are responsible for creating learning materials for cantors or for lay people who want to understand the system. Maybe can use these ideas, and we'll see next week one of the ways to maybe redefine those modes, which is a project that needs to go on, especially since, well, again, this is a topic for a whole different discussion, a whole different lecture. Maybe we'll bring this topic up another time. What we are all experiencing these days as this some kind of not an earthquake, but there's something going on with the Ashkenazi tradition and the fact that it opens up in a way more maybe democratized. A lot of things come in and replace traditional nusach, new tunes, and the modal framework is not very stable anymore. Perhaps because lack of knowledge, perhaps because lack of theory, because lack of learning the system, that tacit knowledge that we mentioned before, those things that are not written in any book and need to be learned in order to keep this tradition stable, keep it is changing, because that's what tradition does. If it hadn't changed, we wouldn't have been talking still about that thing that has been done for past 300 years or so. But because a lot is this phenomena is so much wider now, and the possibilities are enormous, and we're all exposed tremendously to more music and more options, and every synagogue basically is different. So what is there? What is Ashkenazi tradition? And what we're talking about here is the understanding of that makes it Ashkenazi. Thank you for your patience. Thank you, Boaz.
Okay, before we go to questions, there are two things that I want to add because you said that. First of all, this framework is, there's a huge amount of degrees of freedom, which we'll see next week, but it can incorporate new things and get rid of old things, but this connects into new. Once we figure that out, and I mean, I figured out, I have articles on that, then we get also to the idea of what Nusach does. In other words, Nusach is not just important because it's tradition. By the way, the tradition keeps changing. It's not important because it tells us what day it is, because we know. There is something much more, much deeper and constitutional, and has to do with cognition, etc. But again, we have to incorporate this theory, and then we can also solve those problems. In other words, the trying to establish a theory that works has immense effect on all of these other issues that there are arguments about, etc. And then there, I mean, I was not going to go through the chat, but there is something that I really think I need to correct. Agnes Corey said that I scrolled too fast in the Friedman, and she saw it again in Gibson. First of all, I don't think that he may have things that use that scale, but he doesn't actually bring that scale as part of the theory or as a concept in of itself. What you call Hungarian Gypsy scale has a whole bunch of other names, raised fourth. Of course, that's most people call it Ukrainian Dorian. It's not something new. Friedman might have used it here and there, but it's not part of his theory, and it's not in the examples. I think I'm not going to mention Ukrainian Dorian, maybe a little bit as a part of how it functions within Adonai Malach. That's just the corrections that I want to make right on top, right when we start. So now questions and answers or whatever.
So we're opening the floor. Maybe Lori, can everyone unmute themselves?
I saw Benny first.
Yeah, so I see Gedalia, Alexander, you're still muted. You're still muted. You need to unmute.
I think I'm unmuted, yes. Thank you, Dr. Tarsi. That was a
yes.
really interesting presentation. I really enjoyed reading your papers, the ones that I've read as well. has a couple of questions and observations. I'm very interested by Sholem Kalib's work, what he's done so far, and he seems to be very much in the motivic camp. And just wondered what you said about his thesis, which seems to be that every tefillah has its own nusach. So he does away with this whole concept of the modes, really, I think. And he would say, Ein Ka'erkecha, the Magin Avot, these all have their own specific nusach for themselves. They've got different motifs, and some of them might overlap. But essentially, each one's got its own nusach, and he really tries to work out what are the common motifs for each one of these texts. And I think he systematizes it that way. That's my first question to you. The second one is, you talk in your papers about early attempts to try to associate modes with quasi-Greek modes, and you highlight the drawbacks with doing that. If we sort of disprove those theories, do you then have any replacement theory, a theory that could that could explain the origins of Jewish music and where the particular scales that we use do actually come from?
I'll start from the end because trying to find the origin and what it started, or for that matter, what it sounded like in the 14th century, is the problem. First of all, I don't know. We don't know. We have to admit that we don't know. There are all sorts of different speculations. There's some ideas that actually I don't want to get into the details, that maybe we're talking about the 16th century before it was something else. The problem is, again, all of those people, that was the most attractive question, like the origins and the antiquity and all that kind of stuff. And when you try to do that study while creating a theory, you get a theory that doesn't work. So the problem is not, does the theory help us identify the sources, the origins? I would say the attempt to identify the sources creates a theory that doesn't work. And we have to just be satisfied with the fact that we don't know. I'm working with Ruta Cohen a little bit on some things. Once we sort of find a working theory, and again, it's a theory that doesn't have one over-governing principle, because it has to do with basically with cross-repertory motifs. I wrote about that. Then we may be able to start to trace some things. But the process should be, first let's establish what it is and what the theory is and how it works, and then try to speculate or try to use that in order to find the origins, and not vice versa. And again, the temptation to find this is in the way of clear theory. So far as you mentioned another thing, we don't know. We don't know where they came from. Caleb. Caleb, first of all, there is what it should have been is it's a good annotated anthology. His contribution was that he brought a lot of sources that otherwise we didn't know. He interviewed them, although some of them are just reprint of things that we have in print, and we can just check the origin. The problem, the general problem with Caleb is that basically his first volume is not so much an anthology, so much as sort of unfolding a certain theory, but he basically reiterates the same concepts. Even using first of all, I didn't get from him the idea that we don't even have modes, but it's true. He does sort of follow the same thing as Cohen. In other words, he does go by, we have different categories and they're defined by time and occasion. But that doesn't undo the fact that it's more complicated than that. And yes, within that framework, we have to look at different principles of organization. What I looked at Adonai Malach and Magen Avot is just one particular way in which we can redefine Schneider. There are other ways, there are other parts of the repertoire that work in totally different way. But we still have to explore them too. It's not enough just to say, oh, well, this is how they are. Especially because we have an improvisation factor. In other words, he can bring a printed source that's how he does it, but we know that we can also do it differently and it will still be considered the same. And the question is, okay, so what holds it together? What does have that underlying structure by which we can define all these things? That's so far as Callie.
Thank you, Agnes. You're very keen to ask a question.
Well, can you hear me?
Yes.
You can hear me. But I don't.
Yes, yes.
I don't have the knowledge that Boaz has and Amalia has, but I think Boaz misunderstood me. So I just would like to expand a weeny bit. My point was that that mode which I spotted in the early pages of Friedman, it does turn up in Romanian folk music, and it does turn up in among the 113 Arabic modes, and so on. So my question really is that, is it possible to analyze Jewish music from the point of view of tonal music, like major and minor, when perhaps it just won't work because it's modal music? So anyway, this is my question, and thanks for allowing me to expand on my original observation.
Yeah.
I just want to finish, if I could just finish with Bartók, who did find this mode in Romanian music, and then he did specify that you can find it everywhere else, in Arabic music and here and there and everywhere. So yeah, so thank you for your attention.
Yes, we know. I did take it into it. It did not escape my attention. Two things. First of all, I don't know if maybe you had it you saw it in Friedman. Although I suspect that you are actually mistook it from what we call avaba, but maybe it's there. It's not uncommon. The point is two things. All these scales in Romanian, the Romanian and Mediterranean and Arab, etc., just because it has an augmented second doesn't make it the same scale. There are different scalar construction in which the augmented second appears in different parts of the scale, and it's even different scale system because the makam doesn't even work as scales but as tetrachords, etc. So yes, all cultures outside of Western practice has an augmented second as a possible melodic gesture. But it still requires us to make a distinction between each one of those cases. So far as, yes, first of all, there is some similarities to Romanian music in the Nusach. Again, it's sort of based on some kind of total relationship, but we cannot really rely on total relationship because even intuitively, Romanian dunyas are not like Magen Avot or Adonai Malach. We know that they're two different things fundamentally. So the theory has to sort of illustrate that difference. And the fact that they both have augmented second doesn't actually just blurs the theory, the territory. Not to mention that the makams have different tune systems. The makam motivic behavior is completely different, even in concept, in its connection to text, occasion, etc. We're talking about a whole bunch of way different practices and disciplines. And again, I think that the mistake that people made is lumping them all together in order to show some kind of connection or unity, whereas the idea is to first splitting each one of them and understanding it, and then we can go and try to make comparisons, not the other way around. And again, I think that most of those would not work. And a scalar analysis of our tradition is insufficient. It just doesn't include a lot of elements that we'll see next week. Even if you say, okay, a student wants to do something in the Magen Avot, you give him a minor scale. What are you going to hear? You can hear a whole bunch of things. You can hear Mozart Requiem for that matter. So you won't. The scales are not the basis for as a conceptual methodology. Moreover, once we look at it in detail, we see that the scales, first of all, they don't really function so much as a scale. It even pushes the envelope of what the definition of a scale is, and what scales in general help us in understanding something. All of this comes into question when we really examine how this system works.
Alex Knapp.
You're muted. He's muted. He is muted.
I'm okay now, I think, I hope. Thank you very much. I was just saying thank you very much indeed to Boaz and to Amalia. So what I'd like to comment on really is that it seems to me that the whole concept of scale is a very Western way of looking at musical structure. It's very Western. And the people that you mentioned earlier on were trained very much in, were from the West, in continent of Europe, and then to America, etc., etc. And even though they obviously had a deep sense of Chazanut and Nusach and the various structures, Tamei Hamikra, etc., 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 nevertheless, if they were trained in Western music theory, then they would have thought perhaps that scales were the basic and fundamental unit of melody, or at least a way of understanding melody. Whereas that seems to me a problem right from the very beginning, by starting off with scales and then trying to work out Jewish music materials on the basis of scale. It seems to me that Jewish music, the traditional style of the cantor, is based on motifs. And that then these motifs for the different services that exist, the different seasons, the different festivals, the different occasions in the liturgical calendar, are then rationalized, and the musical material that you find for these things are then rationalized and therefore then somehow analyzed and rationalized into a scale pattern. And then that is regarded as the framework within which it functions. But I totally agree with you that that is not the case. I don't think that a scale is necessarily a useful way of defining traditional cantorial music, because it does then lead to all sorts of approximations and distortions, and things are lumped together which don't necessarily belong together. The best one could say is perhaps that a scale would be an umbrella of musical motifs that use similar but not necessarily the same materials. And so therefore, if one talks about Adonai Malach or Magen Avot, Ahava Rabbah, Mishberach, all the various kind of umbrellas of musical motifs, then one can say that they do maybe have certain intervals and certain melodic content. They share those things, but one can't go beyond that, because each one, as shown in Kohon, Baruch Kohon, functions differently according to the particular services for which they are used. So I'm wondering whether one should stop using the scale as the basic unit from which one then extrapolates the motifs, rather the other way around. Start with the motifs, and if there's a scale which it matches, well then maybe that is something that one can consider. But I don't think the term scale itself is helpful. And indeed, going back to the modes of ancient Greece and the church modes, the church fathers got the modes wrong. In other words, they misunderstood the ancient Greek modes. And so therefore they applied the wrong names to the modes. And so that came at a later stage. And so therefore one cannot really think of the church modes as the same as the Greek modes, not only in terminology, but also in terms of interval as well.
I think you it somewhere, because it goes all over the place.
Okay.
First of all, yes, we know there's books that are coming out that even with the Christian theory, the theory doesn't represent the practice. It's not news, and we don't have to involve that with us. Yes, I mean, basically repeated what I assume you heard from the beginning, because I said in the beginning that the detour, the diversion from trying to define Steiger in what it really is, and it just went into scales, which again we see doesn't lead us very far. And yes, we know that there are all sorts of reasons that I didn't get into. I'll give you a bibliography of 20 articles. One of them covers that as well, including the effect of European in their influence about outside of music, the limitations of other theories, etc. And again, let's not go into analyzing the problem of the church or the Makam for that matter. One thing I need to correct, or at least adjust. Scales or scalar elements is not completely out of the question. Again, we're not talking about one governing principle. There's some repertoire sections that sort of behave in a certain way in which the scale matters. There are some in which it doesn't. As I said, even the idea of what the scale is and how it helps us understand it is different. But again, there is some scalar elements in also all modes, but the problem is, first of all, they do not direct traffic, but to see, once we build it, to see what scalar elements still tells us about the mode or how it functions, and it's very different depending on the part of the literature, the liturgy that you examine. And secondly, just saying motifs is oversimplified. It's much more than just motifs, and even the idea of motif has to be redefined or sort of expanded. There are different things going on. Some of them we can call motifs. I usually call them motif types. There are different degrees of freedom. Sometimes it's not a matter of motifs at all, and it is a matter of a tetrachord that is a scalar element, etc. Finally, no. There are all sorts of theories outside of the West that are very much scalar. Even the Makam is very much based on scale, especially after the convention. It's very scalarly defined. Same thing about ragas, same thing about other, not all of them. Yeah, the Dakshta is a little more melody, but I don't think it's right to say that out of the Western, that scale is just a Western concept. It is right to say that we really have to take another look of even what a scale is, how it helps us understand the repertoire, and whether we need it in order to define. And again, we can't just sweep it under one observation. It varies greatly from different places, different examples.
Mark?
Hi, I think I'm unmuted? Okay, so thank you so much, Boaz and Amalia, for this wonderful presentation. I think this critique of what we know is, or excuse me, of what's been documented or given to us really needs to happen, and I look forward to your continued work to that critique, and particularly look forward to what you're going to be offering next week. I feel that in my experience with teaching at Hebrew Union College for the years that I did and teaching modal theory, one needs to say something to to really teach students. And as Amalia said, the things that are out there, as imperfect as they may be, are the things you have to use, because there's really potentially really nothing else to really use. So I think that finding the good solutions, we just look forward to what you're going to offer. But the question I want to really throw out is, I just wonder if this aspect of a theory can even exist, from the standpoint that there are so many different sources, there's so many different historical factors of Romanian, Polish, German, I mean, so many different things factoring into these equations, that I remember, talking to, Joe Levine about his book, that I think what motivated him was to try and find, as he called it, the unified field theory, the kind of like, great mystery of physics, unified theory that will really kind of discuss everything. And I just know that methodologically, the ethnomusicological task is to say, we can't make these really huge and large statements about, traditions that are really vast and desperate, where we really don't have a lot of historical narrative or information, but we can look at isolated traditions. It would seem to me that potentially, if we looked at Bear's Bal Tefillah, even though there's a lot of variety in the things that he offers, and you look within a particular repertoire, is it, is that an approach where we find methodologically that we take a contained repertoire and see how a theory works within that, because of these many other factors. So I think what you're doing is great and tremendous, and I'm just thinking with you in terms of how we can find possibilities.
Oh, that's something that I'm writing an introduction for. Yeah, well, first of all, yes, as I said, it's a huge framework. It's a semi-open framework, because there's always room for other things. Some of it is different traditions, there are different sources, etc. Two things. First of all, yes, we cannot, again, even if what you're talking about, one theory, I mentioned one governing principle, because there is theory, it just covers all sorts of different governing principles, depending on which part of it you're looking at. In terms of again, some places there is more variety. Sometimes we can see, but it has to do with exactly time, text, occasion. There are particular cases of Chamol al Maasecha where we can see sort of a one tradition, another, but it's not like separate, distinct, also the different traditions. It has to be done piece by piece. Every little section maybe have to be dealt differently, and though we can't cover everything, basically next week, and that has to do with Alex too, because Alex is starting to talk about how to do it, and that goes into next week. All I'm doing next week possibly is just presenting one or two cases of how we can look at one thing. Then there is a whole bunch of other things. The way to do it, well, first of all, not to give up. We just have to realize that it does not cover in one principle and address different pieces. One thing that I sort of object to when people come and say, well, what about Polish tradition as opposed to German tradition, etc. There's some definitions that in which when we look at the overall structure, there is if we want to define Adonai Malach, there's only one Adonai Malach. The difference between the different versions is when they use it, if they use it, how they use it, etc. So we have to deal with each part of the repertoire in different ways. Some of that, yes, we have to divide into different versions or different variants. And we also have to realize that no matter what source we look at, every source has places where it takes complete freedom, where it goes to somewhere else. So I think overall, even the new traditions, they have a conversation with some sort of an inner sort of core of how those things are. But again, even with Bear, we know that there are things that is totally out there. But there is sort of an overall, sort of vague, fuzzy, has to be defined in all sorts of different ways, core of how it behaves, in which all the other exceptions and open-ended either converse with or don't pay attention to. But yeah, it's not one theory. I think it is one theory, it's just the idea of theory is different from what we think theory is. In other words, it's different principles of governance in different cases. Martha?
Hi, thank you so much for your presentation and discussion. It's really, really fascinating. I have one methodological question, and I'm not sure because I came late. Maybe you mentioned this in the beginning, then I'm sorry. How did you, or how do you approach the source, or how do you go into the musical analysis? Do you do it like by hand, let's say, or do you use computation analysis tools? Because I'm wondering if it would be helpful to do like a distant reading. People do, scholars do in literature studies, to have a big corpus of to take a big corpus of data, of sources, and then like try to find certain patterns or yeah.
Okay, first of all, again, it depends on the material. Some material exits more towards that, some not. I want to say, first of all, no, I don't try to computerize or even really quantify it. Interestingly enough, the late Moderna, especially in Israel, they were obsessed with making things work on a computer. Dalia Cohen, everything, I made a program, it shows that it works, even Avenary, and they were obsessed with counting notes, etc. My approach, first of all, no, I don't do it by computer, but I also think it's not the point. Eventually, it has to be computed by people's, I'm forgetting the word. Anyway, cognition. It boils down to cognition. In other words, speaking or identify in ways that we as people absorb the information. And so trying to computerize it, well, it could work if it also worked for us as people. In other words, we may hear, we realize that there is a recitation tone there. If I started to count it, etc., maybe I'll get to other conclusions, but of our perception, we hear it as such. So basically, I'm going by, well, how do we hear it? And well, I look at the music. When I look at music, I hear it. And some of the methodology you'll see next week. But no, I don't. I think that trying to make it fit a model is the wrong way to do it, and especially and again, it was part of the Moderna. It's part of trying to fit it into one drawer, and it's not. It doesn't work that way. You can again try to approach it from completely different ways, even to work in the computer, but then it would not really fit the concept. The theory has to somehow match the practice, and somehow match how we hear it, how we perform it. Even though I could make it much more accurate by some kind of a model that will give everything different numbers, it would not really describe what the thing is. We have to sort of still humanize it into how it's transcribed into the experience that we have. And again, I said experience is not just music, and how we conceive it, how we experience it, how we perform it, so that it fits our concept of what it is. I don't use computers for that, and I don't try to. Yeah, I mean, we have precedents of Dalia Cohen and Ruth Katz and Avneri who really tried to do it a computer, and it's sort of meaningless. I mean, yeah, they really were fascinated by the computers because it was only starting to be there, but I don't think it carries any meaning for us so far as understanding the phenomenon. There was somebody else.
Geraldine, are there any more questions? I don't see any other hands.
First of all, I just want to make a comment. Next week, I'm going to start to see how we can reconstruct, but again, keep in mind, I'm just looking at one particular piece of something that maybe resembles something. It doesn't mean, it doesn't have many implications on a lot of stuff that's outside in the repertoire that doesn't work like this at all. I can't cover all of it together, including what's important and what's not important. And secondly, Geraldine, I have about 20 articles. Again, I'm skipping over a lot of things. I'm skipping over examples, over arguments, over justifications. I have a bibliographic list that I actually gave you, and we can, if you can find a way that I can just give it to people, then whatever interests you, or you have a question, maybe by the title of the article you'll be able to find something, including how nusach, so to speak, once we sort of figure out the system, helps us shape a particular liturgical experience. And that sort of does plug into all sorts of other issues that came up here. Because let's not forget, the whole thing comes to serve a specific experience. And I don't want to say necessarily religious, but liturgical. And it's very specific, and you can either serve it or do something that doesn't serve it and do whatever you want, so long as you understand what it works and how it works and what it does. And that's some of it next week, just the tip of the iceberg. I can't cover the entire system.
And fantastic. It's been absolutely amazing. And before Mark closes up, I just want to say how you can even try to do this is amazing to me, because we know that this is done differently in 3 synagogues that may be less than half a mile away from each other. So, you know, how can one hope to get a global picture? But it's been fascinating. You've had an audience who've been glued to their sets, and I'm so glad that COZ gives you an opportunity to give time to expound this, and that next week we'll try and look and see how we can put it together again. So that's going to be fascinating. I'm just going to tell you what's coming after that. Not that we interested, because we're still so interested in what you're going to do. But after that, we have Jeff, who's here today, going to talk to American composer Bruce Adolphi on the 6th of April. And after that, the week after that, Edwin Sarusi is going to be talking about new approaches to Ladino song. And then after that, we've got Jeremiah Lockwood talking to Meir Baruch-Kon, one of the foremost liturgical experts in the Satmar community. So we can't say there's not a variety for you. But so for me, I'm wishing everybody happy Pesach, and don't forget to come next week. I'm sure you'll be mutzed out and ready for some more of our theory. So over to Mark.
So a big thanks to Boaz and Amalia for a wonderful session. I know that a number of people already had to leave who I'll send their good wishes, but I think it's really important, as Geraldine just articulated, that we can have a two-part session for such an important topic, and one that is really so significant. And we look forward to part two of this topic, and really, interested to hear where this discussion takes us. And Geraldine and I can work on how to try and take the articles that you've listed, Boaz, and disseminate them, because this is a good opportunity for people to learn about material that they may not know. So wishing everyone a Hag Sameach, and we would look forward to seeing you next week. And between now and then, and just enjoy the wonderful freedoms of Pesach. Take care.
Thank you all. Thank you, Boaz.
Thank you.